Hello, Disruptors. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Karen Finney, and like President Obama, we're going to be talking about equality, taking on the GOP's fake war on Christmas, and remembering the man who fought for peace, equality, and reconciliation around the world.
He no longer belongs to us. He belongs to the ages.
What we want in this country is a non-racial democracy. We do not think in terms of color at all.
The biggest issue that I see out on the horizon is how do we make sure an economy works for everybody?
The greatest single challenge facing our globalized world is to combat and eradicate its disparity.
How do we do those things that reduce inequality in our society and broaden opportunity?
I've spent some time in South Africa. He was a communist, this man.
Yeah.
He was a communist.
I would make the argument that, we have a great injustice going on right now in this country with an ever-increasing size of government that is taking over and controlling people's lives, and Obamacare is front and center in that.
Yes, he just compared fighting the health care law to fighting apartheid.
Freedom fighter, a radical, a disruptor of the highest order. In Xhosa, his birth name means literally pulling the branches off a tree. Pulling the branches of a tree. And pull he did. President Mandela not only freed a nation, he reminded the world of our common humanity. He put the good of the South African people, all South Africans, above all else. Over the course of his 27 years in prison, Mandela wisely used his time to prepare, to plan, and to embrace both forgiveness and reconciliation. He learned to let go of hatred for other people, recognizing that one of the true evils of apartheid was how it turned people against one another. In his first press conference following his release in 1990, Mandela was himself moved by the broader change that had begun to take place in his absence.
It's a totally different South Africa. And along the route, I was surprised to see the number of whites who seem to identify themselves with what is happening in the country today amongst blacks. I was absolutely surprised. And I expected that response from blacks. But the number of whites who seem to feel that a change is absolutely imperative.
I had the honor of meeting Nelson Mandela when he visited the Clinton White House for a state visit in 1994. It was his second trip to the United States and his first as South Africa's first black president. Like so many, I was personally inspired by Madiba to believe in the possibility for positive change through collective action. Having been a part of apartheid protests in high school and college, to see him standing there shaking my hand was almost overwhelming. From what seemed a hopeless imprisonment to his release, and then to the presidency of his country. Joining me now, Dr. Mary Frances Berry, history professor at the University of Pennsylvania and founder of the Free South Africa movement, and Michael Skolnik, editor-in-chief of globalgrind.com. Thanks to you both for joining me. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Berry, I want to start with you because I was reading a snippet from an interview that you gave where you were talking about literally the day that President Mandela was released, and you saw him and met him in Cape Town. Can you tell us about that?
Right. I had gone to Cape Town with others who had been in the Free South Africa movement, and we persuaded the government that if we got there and we saw that the sanctions had improved things, we might have a press conference and make them feel better and the world feel better about them. And they believed us. We fooled them. And we got there, and once we got there, we raised hell all over the country and demanded that we see Nelson and that Nelson be released. And one night we were in a hotel in Cape Town, and the press followed us everywhere. It was big news all over the country. We were in the hotel, and the message came from the ministry that you don't have to keep raising hell all around here. We're letting him out tomorrow. And so we were in Cape Town, and we were in the mayor's office in Cape Town, on that day when Mandela came in. But one of the things we did is when we found out he was being released, we told everybody else, and the hotel, the workers stopped working and everybody started dancing the toi-toi all over the place, and it spread all over town. But anyway, he came into the room, and after all those years of working to free him and to end apartheid, we saw him. We only had old pictures of him. We didn't know what he looked like. We'd been asking Winnie and we'd been asking his daughters, what did he look like? But we couldn't imagine. And there he was in all of his glory to come in and sit down and speak with us and be with us on that day.
And I know you said, or I read that you also said that you weren't sure what to expect, but that he, you know, that beautiful broad smile was something that just lit up the room, as always, but certainly on that day.
Yes, he had that twinkle in his eye that had Nelson Mandela loved. He was witty. He loved a joke. He was funny. He was serious, but he was also funny. People don't. He was a human being.
Sure.
And he had that twinkle in his eye, and he was dapper because they'd given him nice clothes to wear that day, and he liked to be well dressed. And he was such a handsome man anyway. And here he was, and we thought that he was going to be fragile, frail, we thought. And there he was, and he came and he hugged everybody, he kissed us, he thanked us for what we had done, and he and Winnie sat down, and we all talked to each other like family before he went out to speak to the crowd.
Wow. You know, Michael, I guess that's how I always think of Nelson Mandela. Just even as he got older, he still looked so strong, and that twinkle in his eye and that wonderful smile, something, it was so reassuring and so powerful at the same time. Tell me, because, you know, I specifically wanted us to, you know, share our experiences from across a couple of different generations here. And I know you were just a kid, basically, when that happened, but it inspired you as well. And obviously now you're off doing amazing things. Talk a little bit about that.
It's, first, Karen, it's remarkable to be in the company of two people who met this man and to hear the stories from Dr. Barry and just see the photograph of you shaking his hand. I was 17 years old in 1995. My mother took me to African dance camp as a kid, and yes, she was a hippie and still is a hippie. And
Mine too. Right?
And we used to wear these T-shirts, and the back of the shirt said "Stop Apartheid." I didn't really know what that meant in the 80s, but in 1995, when Nelson Mandela came to New York to go to this premiere of Cry My Beloved Country, literally up the street at Ziegfeld Theater, I waited 6 hours, and I got to the theater, I just wanted to see the man. I just wanted to see him in person, and I took my mother's camera. I had no flash in the camera, and I waited 6 hours, and the police were like, "Get out of the way, where's your press credential? You can't be your kid." And I was like, "No, I'm not moving. I have to see Nelson Mandela." And he came out of his limousine. It was like 9 o'clock at night. The premiere had started. He came out of his limousine, and he's wearing sunglasses. And I was like, "That's hip-hop. That's hip-hop. That's my man." And he came out, and I just kind of like, you know, grab and shake his hand, and he was surrounded by security. And I yelled, "Mandela!" And he looked at me, he smiled, and just kept walking in. And for me, as a 17-year-old kid, just to get, as the doctor said, that twinkle in his eye, just like the look, the look was good enough for me, and certainly has inspired my work ever since.
Dr. Barry, it sounds like Michael could have been with you on that when you were there raising hell. It seems like he would have been a great asset when you were there.
That's right, but let me just make sure I say this for your audience, that although this was all of what we said is true about Nelson Mandela, he was also a serious man. I remember when he came here to this country, and it was in Washington, and the conversations that we had with him, in his heart, he was so eager to figure out some way to solve the poverty problem and to make real change. I mean, there was the reconciliation, there was the avoiding a bloodbath, there was to make sure that the democracy was enshrined in South Africa. But in his heart, and as I think about him now, he was never able to achieve what needs to happen, which is to do something about all those millions of poor South Africans and the AIDS crisis and all the problems that beset them. And so this was a goal that he had too, not just being the guy who was pleasant and conciliatory and everybody loved him, but he knew the harsh reality.
And many people have described him as being very tenacious, Michael, that he was definitely and you can tell, I've read his autobiography, he was one heck of a negotiator.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting part of how we remember him, right? I think in his age at 95, we think of him as the father of a nation, right? And we think of him as this warm, sort of, compassionate, grandfather who would hug you. But this man was a freedom fighter.
Yeah.
Like, this man was tenacious in his belief that South Africa would one day be free. This man was not someone who would lay down and say, I'm going to do 27 years in prison and go to sleep and hopefully I'll get out one day.
Right.
He fought every single day he was in prison because he knew one day when he got out he would free that nation with his comrades, not just him by himself. I think it's to be said, there's so many heroes in that country that fought alongside Nelson Mandela. But as we remember him, certainly I believe I agree with Dr. Barry, that warmth we should always remember. But let us not forget how much this man fought.
You know, Dr. Barry, final question to you. I mean, I think it's been wonderful to hear and see the remembrances of Nelson Mandela this week. But he was a complicated man. As you say, he was a serious person. As I understand, he liked to watch The Honeymooners. But he had, I mean, he was a real human being in that he'd had a real journey in his life to come to the place where we now know him and respect him.
Right. The goal was to end apartheid. The goal was to improve the conditions of people in his country. And he thought about that and tried to figure out strategically ways in which he could make some kind of change. And so everything he did, in a sense, was strategic. He was a human being. He was a fine human being. But it was, let's not forget, he was a great strategist. And yes, he was. I hear people saying, you know, he was a radical, and I think the lead into your show, something about him being a communist and this and that and the other. What he was a guy using everything he could think of and doing it in every way possible to try to achieve freedom for his people.
Right. Dr. Mary Frances Berry, it's a real honor to have a chance to talk to you. And Michael Skolnik, it is always great to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.